So everyone will call to order, and in accordance, Lori will take attendance first.
All right. The roll call I will now conduct, and please answer aye if you're here. So we have Janet Foster.
Here.
Mary Ellen Lenahan. John Forte. I believe he's absent. David Luber.
Here.
John Solu.
Here.
Carmine Toto.
Here.
Chris Kellogg.
Here.
Karen Gicey. Here. And Jill Rhodes. Absent. Okay.
Okay, so in compliance with the Open Public Meetings Act, adequate notice of this meeting has been given by transmitting a copy of the meeting to the Madison Eagle and the Morris Daily Record and posting a copy on the bulletin board in the main entrance to the Borough Hall and filing a copy with the clerk, all on April 2nd, 2019. And copies were made available to members of the commission.
Thank you. Okay, our first order is we have some minutes from the meeting of March 12th, our last regular meeting. The minutes in draft form were sent to all the members. A couple of copies if anybody needs that. And if you've had a chance to review them, are there any comments or questions about those minutes? I will say, Lori, I think you did a fabulous job of trying to summarize a very dense discussion last time, so thank you for that. All right.
Okay, I move for approval of the minutes.
Second.
All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Hearing none, the minutes will be passed, and we will accept them from the March 12th meeting. Okay, we are continuing our order of business, continue our meeting that was opened on March the 12th. And we were at the point where we had testimony from the architect for the applicant about the design of the proposed building at 14 Lincoln Place. I believe we had gotten as far as hearing a very complete report from the architect. There was discussion from the board. There was not time for public comment after that because we reached the witching hour of 11 o'clock. I will add that once again I will close the meeting at 11 o'clock tonight because everybody has to get up and go to work in the morning. So we will try to be expedient in our business. So I turn it over to Mr. Wolfson from Saxum to carry us forward.
Thank you very much, Madam Co-Chairs, Commission members, Commission professionals. Peter Wolfson from Day Pitney here on behalf of Saxum. And as you indicated, Co-Chair Foster, we were here on March 12th, at which time you heard from Anthony Rinaldi, a principal with Saxum, our structural engineer, Wayne Hostetler, and our architect, Jeff Gertler. At the end of that meeting, we had indicated that we had taken in a lot of information, commentary, suggestions, and that we were going to consider all of that and expected that we would be revising plans and submitting them. And we did that. We received back following submissions some comments that perhaps there was not sufficient time for consideration of those revised plans. So as a result of that concern, we propose tonight not to discuss those plans, but instead complete our discussion relative to the condition of the existing building in connection with the proposed demolition of that building.
That seems acceptable and fair. May I add that the resubmitted drawings are available for review in Fran Boardman's office here in the town, upstairs in the second floor in the building department, and so those are open to the public to review during business hours. Okay, shall we begin with your expert or ours?
I have a housekeeping matter.
Okay, sorry.
This afternoon I received a letter from Michelle Donato representing Save Madison Theater, Inc., and she indicated she'd be entering her participation in the hearings. There was a letter that was addressed to me Mr. Wolfson, you received a copy of that, sir? And I forwarded it to the commission with an attachment. In addition to indicating her intention to represent that organization and participate in these hearings, Ms. Donato also asked for another hearing at least to be scheduled. I understand we'll address that at the end of the evening as far as further scheduling, because it would appear that these proceedings have a substantial likelihood of being continued beyond this evening. So I just want to note that for the record. Her letter can be addressed, I would say, most appropriately when the commission has a better feel for how far along we get this evening, and then address the letter's request to the commission at that time. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Wilson.
Is your mic on?
I think so. A little closer. Tonight's presentation then will focus on the existing building's lack of historic and architectural integrity. Next to me, seated, is Robert Kornfeld, who is the applicant's historic preservation architect. He's going to provide his analysis of why the existing building is not architecturally distinguished and how the building has lost its historic integrity due to alterations and decay over the decades. Good evening, Mr. Kornfeld.
Good evening.
Could you please provide the commission and the public with your name and the name of your firm?
Robert J. Kornfeld, Jr. I'm a principal with Thornton Tomasetti.
Could you provide a background on your education, experience, and qualifications?
I have a BA and a Master of Architecture from Columbia University Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation. I'm a registered architect in New Jersey, New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Tennessee. I'm a member of the American Institute of Architects, a director and former vice president of the Historic Districts Council, member of the Architectural Review Board in Hastings-on-Hudson, where I live. I'm a former chair of the Landmarks Task Force of the Bronx Borough President's Office from the 1990s. I researched and prepared a National Register nomination for the Jerome Park Reservoir District, which is in the Northwest Bronx in New York. I'm Vice President and Historian for the Friends of the Old Croton Aqueduct and a member of the National Trust for Historic Preservation.
Can you please describe for the Commission any prior work experience that makes you uniquely qualified to discuss buildings located in a historic district that are appropriate for demolition rather than preservation?
At Thornton Tomasetti, I'm the lead architect for historic preservation and building envelope restoration services, which I've been engaged in for 30 years. Along with forensic investigation and restoration of historic buildings.
Other experience?
I've been engaged in a lot of assessment and restoration projects over the years. After the World Trade Center collapse, when our office was retained as the city's prime engineering consultant, I prepared assessments and stabilization and repair requirements for a number of heavily damaged buildings, including 90 West Street, 90 Church Street, World Financial Center towers, and ended up being involved in the restoration as a project manager of a number of the buildings. My specialty is facade assessment and restoration, which I've been involved in for 30 years and involved in dozens of projects involving historic masonry buildings, ranging from individual townhouses to high-rise buildings like the Empire State Building. I've also been engaged to preserve buildings that are fire damaged or partially collapsed, landmarks also that are in very good condition that just need some kind of pointing and cleaning. So, I'm not, panicked by the sight of a crack.
And did you prepare any reports in advance of tonight's meeting?
Yes, a historic preservation report that was distributed to the Commission on February 11, 2019.
What documents did you rely upon in preparing your report?
The Madison Civic Commercial District Design Guidelines, the Madison Borough National Register Historic District Nomination Form from 1989.
And did you conduct a site visit to confirm your conclusions?
Yes, on Saturday, February 9th, 2019.
And you had access to the interior of the building?
Yes, wherever I wanted to go.
Before we get into your review of this property specifically, can you please go through the borough's National Register nomination and describe the significance of a key building versus a contributing building and the meaning of historic integrity?
Okay, this is a map of the district from the National Register nomination, and I just wanted to bring this up because there was some discussion, especially among the members of the public at the last meeting, that the buildings that are outlined here, and this is the theater, are all considered contributing buildings. Ones that are key, which have a K in them, indicates they have special architectural and associative significance. Ones that say NR means that they are individually listed as National Register buildings. And ones that are contributing mean it encompasses really those buildings, sort of less distinguished buildings from 1870 to 1930 that, to quote the nomination, give the district its prevailing character. And there are other buildings that detract from the district that are called non-contributing, meaning that they are severely altered or are recently constructed, as at the time of the nomination.
Based on your review of the materials and your site visit to the property, please summarize your opinion on the lack of historical and architectural significance of the building.
It's first worth noting that the building was not identified as a key building in the National Register nomination, which was written in 1989 and listed on the National Register in 91. The building is indicated as a contributing building, and it's on the edge. It was noted in the report that the ground floor had been extensively altered. So this is a slide showing on the left the appearance of the building in 1927, and on the right a recent view of the building. As pointed out in the different consultants' reports, there were design features included in the original movie theater design that are either in critical disrepair or no longer present in the existing building, including the original concession stand, replacement of the marquee sign, and the interior split into 4 theaters. Also, the ground floor was originally glazed as storefront all the way across, and there was the theater entrance flanked by retail stores. At some point, outside of the period of significance, the ground floor was extensively altered. It was infilled with masonry, with the arches, sort of, clearly a non-historic. And other walls of the building were covered with a white cementitious coating, which is, in effect, not just like painting the building, which I'll discuss later. It's really kind of a permanent alteration of the appearance of those walls. So, looking at the front facade of the building, and it's hard to see the red outlines here, but the only portion of the front facade that is original is the second story. And when you look at the image on the left of the aerial view of the building, just this portion here, and that's the only portion of the building that has its original appearance. And the design architect estimated that was 4.5% of the facade, because the windows have also been replaced and are non-historic. The original windows were actually 1/1. So in this, you can see the remaining portion of the building, the second story here, actually does not have particular distinction in design or proportions, and it doesn't really reflect the character of the building as a movie theater. The only distinctive feature really is the peaked parapet and the plaque in the upper portion in the center. So I'm going to talk now about the condition of the walls and the interior of the building. The original red brick, apparently at some point, rather than repointing and doing proper maintenance, someone put a cementitious coating on the wall, which has been recoated with layers of coatings and paint. The layers of coating and paint are trapping moisture that can't breathe out and is causing freeze-thaw damage. And there are areas where the brick is visible, where it's spalled off and taken the coating with it. The areas that have spalled have been patched in some places, but that doesn't really restore the integrity of the original brick masonry. This is a close-up view of the brick in one of the areas where it's spalled, and you can see how the brick is extensively fractured. The mortar is debonded. The mortar is probably harder than the brick itself. I mean, the compressive strength is probably higher than the brick because of the brick damage. But in general, the wall is losing its integrity at the granular level. This is a larger scale view. You can see what a widespread condition it is in many parts of the wall. And there are a number of areas where you see the brick is spalled away, and it's almost like a concave opening, and the mortar kind of stays there. And one of the problems that causes is that, my first thought looking at the building was you could, remove the coating and then kind of repoint the brick and restore it. But when it's like that, if you can't repoint brick that's like that because the mortar is harder than the brick. I think the brick will just be destroyed by a grinder or even hand tools if it's repointed. The issue of cracking was discussed by the structural engineers, but in my opinion, the cracking is really extensive throughout the building, and it's not just related to a particular structural stress like foundation settlement. There may have been some minor settlement here, but to me it doesn't justify the amount of cracking and movement in the wall. It's excess of what I've seen in other buildings. And I think the wall itself is really losing its strength and coherence as a structure. And when you see the interior, this is the terracotta backup block at one of the areas. And it should be understood that that this is a composite wall. It's not a structural backup wall with brick veneer. It's all acting compositely, so that brick is structurally part of the wall. And the backup terracotta block is not a very robust material either. And the face brick, as I showed, is in terrible condition. So basically what I'm saying is that there's really not much there. The wall is in poor condition, and in addition, it leaks like a sieve. This is an area where you see water penetration through the wall and through the ceiling. This is the second floor in the front of the building where plaster is falling, and this is not a unique condition. It's not like didn't cherry pick the worst condition. They're really terrible conditions all around. This is another area where you can see active moisture on the wall in the wood lath behind the plaster. This is another area where you can see the extensive moisture infiltration. This is in that same front office area on the second floor. Another area, this is at the front wall on the left. And this is one of the areas where the front wall is separating from the side walls. And this was my biggest surprise visiting the building. I was expecting the roof to be an aging roof in terrible condition, but in fact, there's a roof that's several years old. I don't know how old exactly. It's not 1 year old. It's been there for several years. And it's pretty well installed, and it's unusual that so much water is still in the system beneath this roof, with plaster falling from the ceiling. And this is in the second floor beneath that roof. There are puddles on the floor. There are water-damaged floorboards, extensive water staining all around, and that water is also leaking through to the ground floor. These are some images from the lobby area of water damage. And, the plaster itself is not a very good medium for mold growth, but anywhere in the building that there's, someone has put in some sheetrock or anything that sustains mold well, it's just like blooming like crazy. This is a view of the theater ceiling, and there's been persistent water infiltration onto the plaster ceiling of the theater. And there's an acoustical suspended ceiling beneath that, and it appears that the original plaster ceiling is most likely acoustical plaster with asbestos fiber, which would have been the thing, an architect would have used for a theater at that time. It's friable and crumbling, and pieces have fallen through the suspended ceiling and on the floor and on the seats. The suspended ceiling, sorry, I'm just going to go back for 1 second. There's also fiberglass insulation on top of the suspended ceiling, which is saturated with water. And that's all part of what's overloading the structure of the roof frame, because it's very heavy. That's part of what's also pushing down and collapsing these panels. And I would point out also that when the acoustical suspended ceiling was put in, that a lot of holes were punched in the plaster ceiling. And, without being able to examine it in detail, the plaster ceiling appears to be water damaged to a point that it's not reasonably repairable. I mean, when plaster is wet to a certain extent, it kind of loses its coherence. So overall, moisture infiltration has been occurring for decades, which has largely destroyed or compromised the interior finishes and the exterior. And due to its diminished integrity since the 1989 survey, the building could have been classified as non-contributing if the district were created today.
Based on your experience, can you please describe the difference in the structural cracks and damage observed on this building as opposed to ordinary cracks in brick that may be visible in a single-family home?
That was a question that came up at the previous hearing, and I wanted to point out the difference between a typical home, which is a wood frame structure that could have any type of cladding. It could be shingle, it could be clapboard, or brick veneer, but none of those would be load-bearing materials. And most new buildings today are built with a structural backup wall and then a cavity and then veneer. But this building is a composite wall building where the brick and the backup masonry act compositely.
The HPC's consultant recommends utilizing some of the historically and architecturally significant portions of the building. Has the applicant considered doing so?
Yes, I was informed by the applicant that several items are proposed. The stone plaque is proposed to be salvaged and installed as was shown on the elevation drawings, identifying the building and original construction date. The applicant proposes to utilize the original ticket booth, which was identified on the National Register nomination as one of the most unique features of the building. The original chandeliers may also be utilized. The applicant is also willing to install permanent interpretive material in the new building that will include historic photos and a summary of the building's history.
Based on your conclusion, would you find it to be a logical decision to demolish the building and construct a new building?
Yes, as pointed out in the structural report and testimony and in both of the HPC consultants' reports, the building is in poor condition and is not architecturally significant at the level of the key buildings or at the level that it was at the time of the designation. And the configuration of the building is not practically adaptable to a non-theater use.
Did you review the memorandum prepared by John Hatch, the HPC's consultant, dated March 5, 2019?
Yes.
Are his findings consistent with yours?
Well, in general, yes. At this point, I would only discuss the portions of the report pertaining to the existing building. We both found the existing building in its current state had diminished integrity and significance, and that the type is economically difficult to sustain, and that the existing conditions make any rehabilitation or reconfiguration of the existing building extremely difficult.
I have no more questions.
All right, questions from the commission members for the expert? Yes?
Yes, in your report, you conclude that it is not economically feasible that the capital costs necessary to, and I'm reading from the report, necessary to restore the building combined with the future operating costs would sustain its restoration as a standalone movie theater. As the economic feasibility of restoration or rehabilitation is critical criterion in Ordinance 3999 that would argue against demolition, it is important that we understand the financial assumptions you made that led to your conclusion.
It was not based on a numerical financial analysis. It was based on the fact that the movie theater was not a self-sustaining operation at the time that it went out of business, when they were just paying kind of rent and electric. And it doesn't make sense to me that a new business of the same type could sustain a massive reconstruction cost. Because I would say what the building requires to go back to the state that it was in 1989 or its original 1925 configuration really would not be a restoration. It would be practically cellar to roof reconstruction of the building.
Any other comments, David?
No.
Okay.
Okay. Mr. Cornfield, you mentioned that the applicant was willing to salvage some of the parts of the building, including the box in the front, the chandeliers. What about the doors in the front? Are they unique in any way?
I didn't examine them closely. They looked to me like doors that were installed like after the period of significance and not the original doors. But, I'm not in a position to speak on behalf of the applicant for what he will and won't do. That was what I was informed. That doesn't sound to me like a deal breaker if they are examined and found to be, original doors. But I'm not in a position to make a commitment.
I'd like to ask you a follow-up to Dave's question regarding the costs. So it sounds like you did not do any calculations, no numbers for rehabilitation or operating costs.
If I might, it was the express discussion at the last session that there not be discussion of dollars. That came from your counsel.
No,
Well, I mean, Dave just asked him.
Don't recall any such discussion. It's a factor to be considered. There's no absolute, I think the discussion was anything is possible. There's nothing wrong with the question about whether that was considered by this gentleman. My remarks, as I recall it, was anything is possible, but there is no absolute expenditure that would be fair to talk to the applicant about, but certainly financial considerations are relevant to this inquiry. Thank you.
I'm sorry if I misstated what you said. I was just reacting to the question regarding actual dollars.
I understand.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, so what I was trying to get at was your statement that Dave also spoke to, that building cannot be economically feasibly rehabilitated. So it sounds like from your answer to Dave that you did not run any numbers for rehabilitation or any numbers for operating costs for a new building.
Oh, correct.
Correct, okay. Are you aware of how much of Madison's downtown that we all love is a direct result of philanthropy?
From reading the National Register nomination, I understand that's part of what part of the history. Yes.
Yeah, it's a very strong part of the history. This is one obvious source for rehabilitation costs, is it not?
It's a source. Well, it's a source of. It's not a source of the cost. It's a source of funds.
Yeah, source of funding for the rehabilitation costs. As a preservation architect, are you aware of the numerous sources, and I'm sure you are, for preservation funding at the municipal, county, state, and federal levels?
I'm generally familiar.
So obviously another good source for rehabilitation costs from those four areas. Would not any, I mean, okay, so that's the end of my question regarding cost. On page 4 of your report, you write that an operating movie theater the existing building was at that time an operating movie theater and reasonably met the criteria for inclusion in the district. You at that time were referring to the application for the status with the federal government for the commercial district. So you felt at that time that an operating theater meets that criteria. So I ask you, why would an operating theater reasonably meet the criteria for inclusion in a historic district?
Well, if they're looking at the integrity of the building, which they had determined, that it had lost a substantial amount of its integrity, that would have been. I can't read the, between the lines, the intent exactly of the people that wrote the nomination and what their judgment was. But their judgment was that they felt that it was contributing to the district despite having been altered substantially. And what my point is that 30 years later, when the building has lost a tremendous amount of its material integrity and is no longer an operating building, that it might have been considered differently by the people making. There's a sort of a dividing line between contributing and non-contributing for buildings that were substantially altered.
So do you think that the use of an operating movie theater is also something that one would consider in designating a building as a unique or contributing site in a district?
Well, it's my general understanding that use is not regulated by preservation agencies in general, and in that sense, I think it would not make a difference.
Well, the use does come into effect when you talk about the character and the story. A lot of preservationists talk about the story being told in the district. So a movie theater tells stories just like a train station or a post office. So I don't mean it literally as a use, like a hospital or a single-family home, but use as a contributing element. And it sounds like from what you were saying, an operating movie theater could reasonably meet the criteria. And I'm just wondering if it's partly because of its use, its character as a unique building and a unique site in that sense.
I'm not sure what to add to what I said.
Okay. You also go on to say, due to its diminished integrity since 1989, the existing building could be characterized or categorized as non-contributing if the district was created today. This is speculation.
Correct.
So in the same spirit, I ask you, if the theater were to be rehabilitated by another owner, following the guidelines of the Secretary of the Interior, could it be considered a contributing or even significant building today?
Potentially, yes.
The building is now 94 years old, 30 years since the district was formed. I would think this would confer some additional status on the building, the site, the use, the character. So potentially, yes, you said. On the same page, you proposed two reasons for demolition: the diminished integrity that we spoke of earlier and the fact that the building is vacant. As an architect, you must have worked on buildings with diminished integrity.
Yes, I've worked on buildings that, had experienced fires that were partially collapsed. I would say, for me, a building, even a building that's heavily damaged, where the basic fabric of the building is in good condition, is easy to restore. I felt that this building has kind of gone past the tipping point to where so many of the materials and assemblies are in poor condition that it would have to be nearly entirely reconstructed.
Have you ever worked on a building that was vacant and needed that level of care?
Well, you need to, sort of examine a building more closely to understand exactly what's going on. I feel the building is in very poor condition, and I've never worked on a building that was reconstructed. The percentage of the fabric of the building being reconstructed as this would require.
Did you attend the Association for Preservation Technology Symposium earlier this year on restoring and rehabilitating historic theaters?
No.
I did. It was an eye-opener. Are you aware that there are hundreds of movie theaters, large and small, across the country that are being rehabilitated or restored?
Yes, I've been involved in several projects of that type.
So for anyone to claim that the model of a movie theater or a smaller theater in a downtown is somehow an outmoded model that needs to be jettisoned seems to be, the evidence seems to be on the contrary, that we're seeing hundreds of theaters being rehabilitated all over the country in order to revive and sustain the character of a downtown district.
Well, aside from the extent of reconstruction that would be required for this building, I think that the engineers and your own consultants have also pointed out the difficulty in this particular configuration of adapting it to a use without further altering the building extensively.
Yeah,
like with windows, fire exits. I'm saying if it was not a movie theater.
Right. Did you know that the Lowe's Movie Theater, where the symposium was earlier this year, was vacant for 10 years from 1986 to 1996? It was slated for demolition in 1987. During those 10 years of vacancy, it suffered diminished integrity, and today it is still undergoing rehabilitation. So isn't it true that a building can take years or decades to be fully rehabilitated? It's used, the theater is in use, but it's also being rehabilitated as it's being used. Is that feasible?
Well, I feel that you're, with all due respect, that you're speaking categorically of large-scale restoration. But I think in very few, if any, of those buildings is there an extent of diminishment of the fabric of the buildings to the extent of this building.
Okay.
I have seen ones like I was an advocate for landmarking and restoration of the Lowe's Paradise Theater in New York, which also had been abandoned for many years and was in poor condition in certain respects. But the basic fabric of the building was not that hard to restore. It might have looked visually bad to someone. I'm just saying that the basic fabric of this building is in extremely poor condition, like the walls. I mean, I think if you're sort of completely replacing exterior walls and roofs, at some point, is it even the same building?
Yes, that's a good question. The substantial rehabilitation of any old structure could result in that kind of restoration. So, because we're considering demolition, and I wanted to ask you, we look at demolition in section 8, but 8 refers us right back to section 4, where we are asked to evaluate the reasons why the building was originally designated as a contributing building in the district. So I wanted to ask you about a couple of those criteria for considering a building to be contributing. I'm wondering if you think that the Lions Theater of 1925 satisfies, number 1, the character, interest, or value as part of the development, heritage, or cultural characteristics of the borough.
I would say that the National Register nomination was based on the National Register criteria, which are 4, and I understand that the borough has additional criteria beyond that, which would seem to me to be so broad that really anything that people like a lot could potentially be designated.
Well, I mean, it is our ordinance. So, and preservation
yes,
is typically like local municipalities to have their own ordinances as plug-ons to the national standards. So let's look at something more distinctive, perhaps. Number 4, which again is one of the criteria we have to consider when we're looking at demolition. Number 4 is, does the Lions Theater of 1925 embody the distinctive characteristics of a building type, period, or method of construction, architecture, or engineering? Now, that's not general, is it?
No, that's one of the National Register criteria. I think that it does not in a distinguished way. As a contributing building, it was reasonable to include and was included. I feel that it's lost a substantial amount of integrity since that time.
Okay, yeah, I understand the integrity part, but it is an embodiment, is it not, of the distinctive characteristics of a movie theater? I mean, it distinctively, you may not read it on the facade, as you mentioned, but overall the building does seem to be an embodiment of that type of building.
Well, in the sense that any building is an embodiment of the type that it is.
Yeah, this seems to be looking for a distinctive.
I don't think that it's a
distinctive.
Can you just let him
Oh,
answer the question?
But I wouldn't say that it's a notable, by itself. It's not a notable example.
It's the only theater in Madison that still remains.
It's an earlier former movie theater on the other side of the district that was...
Just the lobby is left.
Chris, are you talking about the theater as it is now or as it was in that picture, 1927?
I'm speaking about the theater as it is now. It still is the building that it was in 1925. It's diminished, but it still is that building. And so we need to go to these criteria when we discuss demolition. We're asked to look at 112-4. And under 112-4, the three items that I thought were particularly relevant to this theater and the reason why it was put in the district in the first place was number 1, number 4, and the last one I wanted to ask you about was number 7, where it suggests that in this case, is the theater a unique location or singular physical characteristic to make a district or a site, which would be this case, a site, an established or familiar visual feature. So is the theater an established or familiar visual feature?
Right, in its current state where it does, really not merit individual designation and where it's greatly diminished from its original condition or even the condition at the time that it was found contributing, then yes.
Okay. I also wanted to ask you a couple other questions. I did not see any reference in your report to urban planning aspects of our district and its impact on the Lions Theater site. As I mentioned to Jeff last time, I'm sure you're aware that the station's passage below the tracks is on an axis with the Lions Theater. This special location seems quite purposeful. Do you think that this location is one of the factors that led to this site being designated as contributing?
Well, the boundaries of the designation clearly include the building across from the station. And it's the building that was there at the time of the study. I can't read into the conditions, what the intent of the builder of the theater or the people who wrote the designation were, but clearly it's an important location.
Yes, I guess that was my question, was that if we ground our site in a slightly wider context of the downtown district, it seems to be strategically located, and I would suspect that might contribute or make it more of a contributing building because it's got a key location. One other thing I wanted to ask you about was the character of a district. One of the things that Mr. Hatch provided us was a reference on districts, and in that reference, I quote, "The district is the resource, not its individual parts. Designated historic districts are significant as a collective whole and must be considered as such and protected in their entirety. This is the primary overarching principle." So here we have, my question for you would be, we have a building that is a contributing member, diminished, and this quotation here is suggesting that the district is really to be seen as an entirety. So peeling off individual buildings seems to be something would be very hard to justify. Mr. Hatch actually suggests that it would be one of the worst things that could happen to an historic district is to have one of its buildings removed. Do you agree with that?
As a general principle, I would say yes. I think that in a case where a building is in the condition of this building physically and in terms of its appearance, I think it's a different issue. I don't think it's a black and white issue, but in my mind, the building has substantially lost its integrity.
Thank you.
If I might just ask a question. In the nomination for Historic District Lions Madison Theater section, is there any reference to its location as being a factor?
No.
And I'd just like to recall the testimony of Mr. Rinaldi, where he indicated that in the two years or so since they've owned it, no group has come forward to try to do a public enterprise in terms of alternate sources of funding. So I just want to recall that testimony.
Okay. I have a couple questions, if I may, Mr. Kornfeld. Can you clarify for us the difference between building condition and building integrity?
Well, integrity is a term that the National Register uses for a number of different things that contribute to a building's significance. So I'm looking at it really in terms of the visual character of the building and its physical integrity. And the physical integrity of a building is very significant. If a building is in poor condition beyond a certain point, it no longer has all of those qualities that made it significant at the time that it was designated.
Is it possible for a building to be in poor condition and have good integrity?
It's possible for a building to have,
Or vice
other types of integrity.
Other types?
I mean, integrity of place,
Okay.
integrity of association. I mean, there are a number of different categories. To me, the physical condition of this building really outweighs a lot of other considerations. And I know, I think it's in worse condition than a lot of people think it is.
Okay. And you mentioned just the surprising finding that the roof appeared to be more whole than you expected, but you called out all the leakage problems inside. Would you say that it is still actively leaking? In other words, when you went to see it in February 2019, is it actively leaking despite that fairly decent roof?
Yes, and despite all the layers of waterproofing coatings on the exterior walls, there are, actively wet-looking places on the wall where plaster is falling off. There are puddles on the floor in the upstairs.
Okay, so the damage you saw is not just old damage that
No,
is sort of held in place by a newer roof.
no, and it's not damage that's occurring due to just current neglect. That it's actually there's been an effort made to maintain the building.
Okay.
But the accumulation of decades of problems just sort of kind of reached a tipping point.
And when you were introduced by your attorney, one of his first questions was your experience in when is demolition appropriate for a historic building. And you qualified yourself very well, but I'd just like to ask you from a 35,000-foot level, when is it appropriate to demolish a building that is on the state and national register, that is covered by a municipal ordinance, and has resonance with a community for its historic and cultural associations?
Well, I don't know an actual written guideline or code that states that. It's maybe more a sense of having been involved in preservation and building restoration for many decades. That is just my reaction to this building.
And so your response to that is, in this case, physical deterioration is the driver of appropriate demolition
physical deterioration along with the extensive amount of changes and non-historic features of the building. I mean, the various alterations.
Yeah, Mr. Cornfield, I wanted to ask you, first thing, couldn't your slides be marked into evidence? Great, thank you. And I don't know if you can put back up the one where you had the movie theater of 1927. Yeah, no, I think that's it. So you've got regular storefronts on the first floor, and then the entrance to the movie and storefront on the next floor. The other side of the floor, which seems to me, I know we're not talking about your new plans, but similar or something along the lines of your old plans, the first floor. Does that seem, yes?
I'm not sure.
Oh, I'm looking at the storefronts, and I think you've put storefronts on in the new proposed building.
Okay, I'm not the design architect.
Okay,
but-
that's fine. That's all. And then
Yes.
as long as we have those as exhibits, I'm fine with that. Thank you.
That was a feature of that design.
For the record, I think we should this evening consider the presentation made by Mr. Kornfein as a single exhibit. I think we're up to A6 for the video presentation.
Yeah, and we'll leave it in some form of media that I don't understand, but somebody who understands that stuff will get it.
We have people.
I do good for people.
Did you have a question, John?
Yeah. Mr. Kornfeld, you also, in one of your earlier slides, indicated that because of all the changes that have occurred since the original construction of the building, that the only part that was of historic significance that remains was the area you circled in red, or you outlined in red. In your experience with restoration projects, have you ever been involved in a project whereby that element has been preserved and restored?
Yes, you mean sort of like isolating a section of a building and supporting it and building something behind it, something like that?
Right.
Yes.
And does that do anything to its historic significance?
Well, it takes away the the setting and a lot of the associations. It's something that's done. I've been involved in projects like that. I would say the biggest drawback for this building of trying to do that would be the condition of the masonry wall, that there's really not enough meat to anchor into. In those cases, you very often have kind of a steel frame that goes in front of, and then you sort of put anchors into the masonry to temporarily support it. And I would be very skeptical of anchoring this wall. And I mean, it would be a kind of colossal effort to retain that one story, which to me doesn't really embody the character of the whole building.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions from the board members?
Before proceeding, Mr. Kornfeld, I wasn't sure when we started as to the last hearing. Did we swear you at that time? I know there was a lot of...
No, I was not sworn.
You acknowledged this evening that all your testimony and evidence and proofs offered to the board, to the commission rather, in this proceeding are the truth and nothing but the truth?
Yes.
And you reaffirm all your statements and evidence?
Yes.
Excuse me, I thought you had been sworn as the prior hearing. Thank you, sir.
Okay. All right. Questions from the public for Mr. Kornfeld. Not speeches, not opinions, questions. If you'd like to introduce a question, please come to the podium. Please sign your name and address and spare our stenographer the joy of trying to figure out how to spell your name. And please try to confine yourself to 3 minutes or less, because we have lots of people who want to talk. So if you'd like to ask questions of Mr. Kornfeld, please step up and we can actually make a line and start to sign in while other people are talking.
Ms. Foster, can I ask one question?
Yes.
Could I ask one question?
Oh, yes.
Yes, I'm sorry, John.
That's all right. You alluded to acoustic plaster and the possibility of asbestos. Was the plaster tested?
No, not to my knowledge.
Okay.
But I think you indicated, based upon the vintage and architectural and building material types of that era, that you expected that it was, and you have experience in observing asbestos?
No, yes.
Okay. Public, sign in and speak.
Rob Pratt with Sherwood Avenue. I'm a trustee of the Save Madison Theater organization. You noted that the original concession stand is no longer there, but if it was typical 1925 not to actually have a concession stand with the front areas being used with the stores, so is that a possibility?
Make sure you're speaking into the microphone.
No concession stand, thank you. Thank you. And also my understanding was that the facade where the stores were removed in 45. So is basically the facade that we're seeing in the recent view is likely 75 years old?
Well, I would just point out that the period of significance of the district ended in 1930. As far as the National Register nomination.
When it was nominated in 89.
That they established a period of significance for what was considered in the nomination.
Okay. And you know all the water damage you can see from the lobby from the second floor, and also the ceiling tiles collapsing. Is there any reason why that's perhaps accelerated in the past 2 years? Since 2 years ago we were seeing movies there?
I have no information about that.
Okay.
I mean, both portions of the building have roofs that are relatively recent. I can only attribute it to decades of neglect, really, but not the current roofing.
Okay, thank you.
I didn't have a chance to respond to your question. Your initial question was about the configuration of the lobby.
Right.
Aside from the fact that there were the two retail stores in the front, I have no information about the configuration of the lobby.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, I'm Sandy Kolakowski. Sandy Kolakowski. Kolakowski. I'm also a board member of Save Madison Theater. Hi, Mr. Cornfield. Did you have an opportunity to review the engineering report, also commissioned by the developer?
Yes.
And is there a reason why there's, in general, you are so more negative about the building than even the structural engineer was?
I think his focus was on the structural system, in the sense of piers supporting the roof trusses, and I wouldn't call it a flattering report. He said that the roof structure was inadequate and overloaded But in, I guess, I've spent many years involved with masonry restoration, and I'm more keyed into the condition of masonry and of brick walls at the granular level, of how the brick and the mortar are behaving. I think, many engineers don't really look at masonry walls that way. They would probably look at it as, something that has a certain value. I'm just saying I think it does not have the value that you would expect of a masonry wall of that size, of that like thickness and composition.
You also say in here about the historic status that since the theater is vacant and no longer operates as a theater, it has low feasibility of being rehabilitated as a movie theater. Can you tell me what you base that on?
Well, not so much that it stopped functioning. Well, I would point out one thing that as it was operating, it was just operating. If you look at the building, it's clear that the systems are all inadequate, and there are a lot of code issues with the building. So it wouldn't be that part of a rehabilitation would be to replace all of the kind of waterlogged ducts. Well, I'm not an electrical engineer. The wiring looks just obviously terrible. The panels, it's sort of, if you could make the building watertight, you couldn't just kind of turn the lights back on and have it be an operating business. It requires a massive project.
But it was operating when the person who's paying you bought the theater. You know that, right?
Yes.
All 4 theaters were operating.
I'm going to give you one more minute, Sandy.
Okay. You also say in your report, I believe that size and scale concerning the proposed building. Are we talking about the?
We're not going to discuss the proposed building, as we said at the start of the hearing. There are revisions to the design, and they're available for review at the borough building offices, and we'll get back to that at a later meeting.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions from the public regarding Mr. Kornfeld's testimony?
Hi, I had a request. I'm not sure if it's possible to grant this, but at the last meeting, my name's David Hanna, but I don't know if I should go on the record because my name is David Hanna, Hanna. Okay. I live on Central Avenue. But like I said, I don't know if I can go into the record because I don't know if I can ask the question I want to ask. Because at the end of the last meeting, we weren't allowed to ask Mr. Gertler any questions. It ended.
His presentation is continuing. He'll be back.
Also, we can do it then?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. Hop up, sign in. If you're, people from the back, you can make a line and sign in so we can be a little quicker on this. Thank you.
Hi, Dorothy O'Brien, 38 Crestwood Drive. In relation to what was still original to the building, I did not hear mention concerning the restrooms. I believe from looking at it that the walls, at least with the ladies' room, you have the powder room section when you enter, and then the second section where the plumbing is. I can't comment on the men's room. Are those sections, at least that was walls, that breakout, is that original to the building?
I have to say I did not visit that portion of the building.
Okay. And the theater manager office on the first floor between the lobby and going to the theater, would that section also be original?
I never reviewed an original floor plan of the building, and I don't know exactly which walls are original or not original, aside from certain ones that appear to be, like the main, lobby walls in certain areas.
Okay, because I was going to next ask about the walls going to the first theaters on the 1 and 2 on the floor.
I'm afraid I can't answer that question.
Okay. And my other question is concerning, again, the viability of the theater making money. If, in fact, the prior tenant was actually was making a profit, and we seem to be assuming that they were not, but assuming that they were profitable, does that change your evaluation concerning the viability of the theater operating going forward?
If I might, I don't know if you were here, there was testimony that the prior operator closed down precipitously his own operation.
This gentleman can respond. If you can respond to that question, if you know, Mr. Whitfield.
I don't know anything about the finances or operations of the previous operator.
Okay. That's it for my questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Next.
Hello, Larry Wickman, 33 Walnut Street. Hello. Regarding the application for the National Registry, the 1989 one, at the top of the form, there's 5 primary functions listed, are criteria, and under the recreation and culture line, there is a single listing for movie theater. So there's only 5 clarifications for the historic district, and the movie theater is the only one under the recreation and culture line. It's right there on the top of the form. Losing the theater would entirely strike that line from the form for us. Is that true? It would have nothing to enter under recreation and culture for the historic district.
I believe that's correct.
Okay. And on the form, period of significance is 1870 to 1936. And on the form there, it says, the small number of buildings constructed since the district's era of significance ended means that the appearance of downtown has remained remarkably unchanged since the first third of the 20th century. With the demolition of this building, that would no longer be true. Is that a fair statement?
I don't know what other changes there have been in the district in that period.
Okay. But then putting up a building that is not unlike any other building, an apartment building, that also would fly in the face of remarkably unchanged for the historic district, wouldn't it? The size of the proposed building in replacement for this building?
Well, it would be a change.
Okay. Well, the form the notes on the application really stress that it's a remarkably unchanged district, and that's one of the qualifications why we got this standing. Another aspect is they say our historic district contains 59 buildings, 49 of which are contributing resources. And the theater, along with the other key aspects, the key buildings, are all part of that contribution. So there are 11 that are, they say most of these were built between 1870 and 1930, so a shorter period of time than the actual 1936, and give the district its prevailing character. The theater was built in 25, so 5 years, well within the frame of this prevailing character and feature of the historic district. Is that a fair statement?
Yes.
Okay, so as this documentation goes on, it zones in on the really critical area that we're talking about historics for. 11 buildings in the district.
I'm sorry, Mr. Whitman. I'm trying to be fair to everybody.
Okay.
Stop, so we can get other people there.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, now. Stop. Okay, sorry.
Good evening. Deborah Fennelly, F as in Frank, ENNELLY, 88 Constitution Way, Convent Station. I'm also a member of the Board of Directors of the Save Madison Theater, Incorporated. Good evening, sir. I just wanted to, if I could, ask a few more questions about the topic of economic feasibility and the opinions that you've given about maintaining and restoring the theater. I was wondering if you are familiar with any other buildings in this area that have been preserved and restored. For instance, the Mayo Center in Morristown.
Not familiar with it.
You're not familiar with it, okay. Are you familiar at all in your work with the economic impact on a community of preserving and restoring a building in terms of income that it generates either by its use or, say, even by the film industry using it if it's been restored as a historic building?
That's somewhat of a complex question. But,
well, do you have any experience with the... Okay.
I can't compare the economic impact of restoring a building versus building a new building. But certainly, the restoration of a derelict building is a positive thing. But the construction of a new building is also economically positive.
One other question. Would you consider a derelict building a building that at the time that it was closed had water pouring in through the roof of the building during, let's say, a rainstorm?
I don't understand the question.
I'm just trying to determine what you would consider a derelict building because the center that I described, which has now become one of the premier performing arts centers in the state of New Jersey and is on the historic list of theaters in Morristown, at the time that it closed in, I think, about 1987, had a roof that was leaking so poorly that they had to use large garbage cans to catch the water. As I said, now it is one of the premier centers of performing in the state of New Jersey.
I would just ask that they be questions.
Exactly. I was going to say questions that could be answered by the expert and through their testimony.
I just wanted to ask one other question. Are you at all familiar with any other theaters in the state of New Jersey that have been restored and are operating as independent theaters in municipalities like Madison?
I'll let Mr. Kornfeld answer that. But
I was involved with the repair of the Wellmont Theater in Montclair when plaster fell from the ceiling. And it was a very different situation because the building was fundamentally sound and it was not a tremendous challenge to repair. I have never seen the theater in the state of, I guess you could say, unsoundness that this building brought back to, to being an operating building in good condition. And I've worked on buildings that, were in various states of poor condition.
I'm sorry, but I just wanted to ask, what could you describe the aspects that make you come to the conclusion of fundamentally unsound? Because now you've used a term that I think we need to have defined.
Well, I pointed out the problems with the masonry-bearing walls, where I believe that they would essentially have to be entirely replaced. And the structural engineers pointed to problems with the floor structure, the roof structure. As I was saying, I see it as being a reconstruction project more than a restoration project.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Questions?
Mary Jo Micucci DeFonso. Micucci is M-I, C as in Charles, U-C-C-I, DeFonso, D-E, capital F as in Frank, O-N, Z as in Zebra, O.
Have you signed in, please?
I will. My address is 12 Washington Avenue, Summit. My family has lived here and still owns property on Lathrop Avenue for over 100 years. This dwelling was built 8 years before my father was born in 1933.
Pardon me?
So my question...
As the commission attorney, if you're going to ask him a question that's based on what you believe to be facts, you have to be under oath. You swear that the testimony you give will be the truth and nothing but the truth?
Yes, I do.
Thank you.
So my question is, you said there was water damage, correct?
Yes.
What is the source of that water? If the roof is pretty much intact, then what's the source of the water? Where is it coming from?
I didn't do an investigation to determine that. It may be, to some extent, water that's just embedded in the building. My impression was that the building is very water permeable, kind of in all directions, and there may be some residual water.
So you don't know if it's the plumbing, if it's from the walls, it's from the roof, you have no idea?
It's from the roof and the walls.
But you said the roof was intact, pretty much.
I did not trace the source of water. Water is continuing to enter the building despite its having a new roof.
Well, wouldn't it make sense that you would want to know where the water's coming from? I mean, to me, this is already on the New Jersey Historic Registry, correct?
Excuse me. You're only permitted at this stage of the hearing to ask him questions.
This building is already on the New Jersey Historic Registry, correct?
Yes.
So why is it not that every effort possible is not being made to restore this building to its original state?
I'm not sure that I see the connection.
Isn't that what this whole meeting is about?
The building has an owner who had a tenant that went out of business, and he's planning what he feels is the proper thing to do with his building.
Just saying, this is what this whole meeting is about, isn't it? Try and preserve this building. Thank you.
Questions? All right, thank you. Any other questions from the public for Mr. Kornfeld? All right. Take a deep breath. We're going to change. Do we need a break? And I'm mostly asking our stenographer. She's okay, so we're okay. All right.
Question?
Yeah, I forgot.
Oh, okay.
Dorothy O'Brien from Crestwood Drive again. I've noticed that the building had steam radiators. Is it possible that the water leakage was from the plumbing, from the heating, from the radiators, the steam heat in the building?
No. I mean, some small amount possibly in certain locations. The leaks I was talking about were kind of like underneath the broad areas of the roof where there was no plumbing.
Okay. Thank you.
Name is Ron Killian from Chatham. Killian. Mr. Kornfeld, have you ever worked through a reconstructed building that has been sandblasted to remove veneer coatings and repointed?
Yes.
What would be so different in doing that with this building?
Well, sandblasting in general is not done because it's an abrasive that very often harms buildings. There are certainly different ways of cleaning and removing different types of soiling or contaminants on buildings, including coatings. It's my opinion that the brick is in such poor condition that you could not remove the coating and repoint the brick without destroying a large percentage of the brick.
My dad owned a construction company. He resurfaced many buildings at Seton Hall University in South Orange on the campus, many churches and schools in New Jersey. If you're alive today, he would love to get his hands on restoring this building. I don't see any problem that he would have with it.
Okay, thank you. Counts. Last call. Questions for Mr. Kornfeld? Okay, hearing none, then we will excuse Mr. Kornfeld for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And we'd like to open up to John Hatch, who is the preservation consultant for the commission.
Mr. Hatch, good evening. Are you comfortable there, or would you rather move around?
This is fine.
You're fine. Mr. Hatch, you've been retained to act as a consultant to the commission in these hearings, is that correct?
That's correct.
What is your training and experience that would qualify you to be a consultant to the board in this application?
I have a undergraduate degree from Princeton University. I have a Master of Architecture from the National Champions University of Virginia.
Nicely stated.
You look tired.
I'm not. I also have a certificate in historic preservation from the University of Pennsylvania. I'm a registered architect in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, New York, Delaware. I have 30 years of experience with Clark Caden Hintz, an architecture planning and historic preservation firm in the city of Trenton. I'm a partner with the firm. I've served for 30 years on the City of Trenton's Landmarks Commission. I've served on the board of Preservation New Jersey. I've served as president of Preservation New Jersey. I served for over 10 years on the board of the New Jersey Historic Trust. Anything else?
That's quite a list there. So you've had substantial working involvement for all the years, which 30 or so in the field of historic considerations and structures and evaluations. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
You've been retained by the commission here to make evaluations and recommendations. Is that correct?
Yes.
Have you ever been retained by the borough before on historic preservation or structures?
Yes. Clark Caden Hintz is doing some work on the Hartley Dodge Memorial. We've done some design work on the East Wing and are doing some work right now planning for restoring the front plaza and the front steps.
And that's ongoing?
That's ongoing, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Hatch. Mr. Hatch, when you were retained by the commission to serve as a consultant in this case, did you have occasion to review the historic preservation ordinance of the borough?
I did, yes.
Did you also have occasion to visit this property?
I did, in February.
And have you had occasion to see the consultant's reports offered by the applicant?
Yes, I've reviewed them.
And you were at the prior meeting?
I was at the prior meeting, yes.
In the ordinance that we have in the borough for historic preservation, and the standards that apply to this particular application or any other for which demolition and preservation factors are to be considered, is the ordinance fairly detailed as far as criteria?
Yes, the ordinance is detailed. There are a number of criteria listed in the ordinance.
Did you evaluate this application in relationship to those criteria?
I did, yes.
Did you subsequently issue, or I shouldn't say subsequently, did you prepare a report in this matter?
I did. I submitted a report on March 5th.
And you've seen the consultant's reports for the applicant, is that correct?
Yes, and I referred to some of them in my report.
I appreciate that. What I'd like you to do this evening, as the consultant to the board for architecture, and with a particular interest, is that a fair summary? Sometimes we'd call that a substantial subspecialty or co-specialty in historic preservation and design. Would you go through with the board and the public and the applicant's representatives this evening your findings, your evaluation, and then your findings as far as the ordinance requirements and the criteria that the applicant would have to satisfy for demolition to be approved or not approved, and what factors and considerations you'd offer to the board in that regard? Feel free to refer to your report.
Great, thank you.
Mr. Hatch, now, as before with Mr. Kornfeld, your testimony will be under oath. You swear that it'll be the truth and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
I do.
Thank you.
I'm not going to repeat things that have already been said about the building.
Thank you.
Much appreciated. And feel in your own words, don't feel confined to your report. Obviously, everyone understands the major issues at hand.
Sure. I am going to just respond to a couple of things that were said earlier and that were specifically in the Mr. Kornfeld's report. In terms of integrity, I just want to say that I have a little bit different understanding from how you've described it. So I think you're talking about structural integrity, and I think certainly the building over the course of its life has there's been serious impact on the structural integrity. and maybe the material integrity of the building. However, I don't think there have been significant changes made to the building since it was placed on the National Register, so I think it can still be considered to be a contributing structure in the historic district, even if the condition of the building has deteriorated somewhat. So I just want to clarify that that is my position about integrity. So my purpose is to give some context for the building and for the district, and some context maybe from an outsider of how to think about this a little bit. The building has been stated numerous times, and the way it's listed in the nomination is that it's a vernacular building. It's a contributing structure to the district. It is not one of the significant structures in terms of its architecture. It's pretty utilitarian. It's even pretty utilitarian for a movie theater from 1925, particularly on the outside. So the most important part of it is the front facade. The sides and the back are completely utilitarian. They were designed to be utilitarian. The exterior design is really all about the front and how it faces onto the street. The interior, I wish there had been photographs of the interior. I haven't seen any original photographs of the interior. Its current condition, as has been stated many times, it's been altered to a large degree. It was originally one large theater. It was divided at some point into 4 theaters. The front lobby the configuration of the front lobby was altered. The storefronts were altered. The arched windows were put on the front. So it is different from the original design. There is still some evidence in the lobby from my relatively quick inspection of the building. You can see some evidence or some marble paneling. You can see some original plasters maybe. And the second floor of the front part of the building actually feels relatively original, even if it's not in great condition. I'm certainly, reading the structural reports, it is clear that there are major structural issues. As someone who has worked on buildings that were in extremely poor condition, the reports. So that's why I stated in my report that I said that renovation of the building would be expensive but not impossible. There are clearly serious structural issues that would add to the cost of renovating it. The building, so there's a cost to renovating the building just given its condition, and then there's the cost associated with what are you going to do with the building. The easiest renovation is one that is going to keep the original configuration of the building, that you're going to take advantage of the fact that it was a movie theater with a sloped floor. So if you can do that, that is going to reduce the cost of the renovation at least somewhat. If you're not going to do that, if a movie theater is not a viable use, then maybe a second use would be as a performing arts space. The sloped floor is designed for sight lines from the audience to the stage, so that would be another use that could potentially take advantage of it. The problem with the Performing Arts Center reuse is that there are other spaces needed to make it a performing arts venue viable. There are all sorts of, ideally you'd like to have fly space over the stage, which this does not have. Ideally you'd like to have a fair amount of backstage space. You'd like to have green rooms and dressing rooms and all that stuff. So to have that as a use would require significant reconfiguration of the building or additions and so additional cost. Other adaptive reuse of the building, completely changing its function, are, I think, more problematic. Just if you're going to put a retail use or some other uses into the existing building, that would be difficult and expensive because you can't have a sloped floor in a retail use or in a residential use. So all of those impact how you think about what you can do with the building and its long-term viability. Now specifically getting to demolition, as I say in my report, I do believe that demolition is the most drastic step that you can take in a historic district without there's no other comparison. By definition, it has a major impact on the historic district. So I'm going to just run through the criteria and give my thoughts about each of the criteria that are listed in the Historic Preservation Ordinance. Again, to give some context for this. So the first criteria has to do with the historic, architectural, cultural, and aesthetic significance of the building. So the Lions Madison Theater, as we've talked about, I think it's a contributing structure. It's clearly not a significant structure, and it's relatively utilitarian. So from an architectural and aesthetic point of view, it doesn't have, from my point of view, huge significance. And particularly since it's been altered a lot since it was constructed. On the other hand, I think it does have cultural significance. It has played an important part in Madison's downtown for many, many years as a movie theater, attracting visitors, serving the people of Madison. And so I think that is its real significance and gets at the crux of the issue, why it's such an important discussion to have. The second criteria is its current and potential use for the uses that are permitted by zoning. So I've talked about that a little bit. Just to briefly recap, so its easiest reuse would be as a movie theater if that were economically viable. More difficult as a performing arts space. The other permitted uses in the zone, residential, commercial, retail, I think would be very difficult it would be very difficult to rehabilitate the building for any of those other uses. I also made the point that I'm not an expert on historic theaters or on movie theaters in the country, but I have seen a number of movie theaters, viable movie theaters in downtown. And in my experience, the ones that are most viable tend to be, at this point in sort of our economic situation in the country, they tend to be niche movie theaters. That they tend to be a little bit smaller and focus on a particular audience and a particular kind of movie theater, particular kind of film type. And so the theaters that I reference include the Princeton Garden Theater, which is, my understanding, it's heavily subsidized by Princeton University, the County Theater in Doylestown, the Showroom Cinema in Asbury Park, and the Screening Room in Newburyport, Massachusetts. The third criterion is its importance to the municipality and the extent to which its historical or architectural value is such that its removal would be detrimental to the public interest. So again, this goes, I feel like it's a little bit of a repeat of an earlier criterion, but it's, so from an architectural point of view, because it is relatively utilitarian, it is not like losing one of the significant structures in the borough. Also, because it is on the edge of a district, it's not part of a row, it is also, that impacts its, how significant its loss is. If this were a part of a commercial row, the middle one, even if it were just a contributing structure, or even if it were not contributing, taking it out of the middle of a historic row would be a very serious loss. It's on the edge of a district, and so it's the loss compared to that situation is not as great. That being said, its most important significance, I think, is cultural and the role that it's played in Madison for so many decades, and that is, I think, the real loss for the borough. The fourth criterion is the extent to which it's of such old, unusual, or uncommon design that it could not be reproduced. So, at least on the exterior, it is quite utilitarian, so I think it would actually be easy to reproduce. And the sides and the back of the building are so utilitarian, I don't think you would want to reproduce them if you were redoing it. But it does have a very nice a nice front. The interior, I don't know how elaborate the interior was, and it's been altered so much that I don't think you can say. The fifth, the extent to which its retention would increase property values, promote business, attract visitors, attract new residents. I think one of the compelling points I heard the first evening was that there are people in Madison who the fact that there was an operating movie theater was of significance to them. That when there aren't that many towns that have a functional, vibrant movie theater in the downtown, and when it is there, you make note of it. And it is an attraction both for the people who live there, it's an attraction for people thinking about moving to the town, and it's an attraction for people to come into the town. But the key is that it has to be operating and viable. If it's not operating, it's the opposite of all of those things. Particularly in its location, across from one of the main entrances of the train station, people are coming in and out of that all the time. If it's not up and running, it actually has the opposite effect on the town. The probable impact of removal upon the ambiance of the district. Again, this is a bit of a repeat of some of the other criteria. It's kind of a background building. It isn't highly detailed. Its storefronts were infilled. So from that point of view, it's not one of the significant structures. Now, its position, I should have talked about that a little bit before. Its position across from the main entrance to the train station is important. It's important to have a building there, something significant, something that's lively. And when the building was up and running, it was a real positive for the district. Now, if the building were to be, I think the worst possible situation here is if this building were demolished. Leaving it vacant is not great because it's kind of a dead point in the district. But the worst possible thing that can happen is if it were demolished and then nothing were put it back in its place. So that, I think, is the worst of all possible worlds. The seventh criterion is structural soundness and integrity of the building and the economic feasibility of restoring or rehabilitating the structure. So the building, there's sort of a range of things that you could do. If you had an operator who was interested in four medium-sized theaters in a downtown, you could theoretically get the building up and running, and I'm going to say this on the lower end of a broad range of costs that you could spend on the building. The building needs to, it's been empty for a couple of years. It has had some additional water damage. And all of the systems need to be rechecked. Everything needs to be refreshed. And so it's not an insignificant cost, but it's on the lower end of quite a broad spectrum. To to restore it or to change it significantly, becomes really a major cost. And to put in a different use into the building, even one that is somewhat compatible, a performing arts space, that moves it to the upper end of that spectrum. And and in all of the cases, I think there are some valid structural issues that have been pointed out, issues that I think the building owners had lived with for many years. You know, you can kind of, when you're just kind of going along and living with the day-to-day, you don't, you know, as cracks are getting bigger, you don't really notice because it's a very small increase day-to-day, and it's not until 20 years later that, oh, that really is a big crack, and there might be some structural issues. So the structural issues, no matter what the function is, even if it is a movie theater operator that wants to use the same 4 movie theaters without major reconfiguration, there are structural issues that have to be dealt with. So that is an important consideration. Number 8 was about moving the building, which I don't think is feasible, so I'm not going to address it. And 9 was whether the applicant will remove and reuse certain important features. And so there are some of the features that the applicant has indicated that they would remove and reuse, including the Lions Theater plaque up in the gable, and there may be other items that are important. You know, the chandeliers, the ticket booth, some other things that might be important to reuse. So it is a contributing structure in the historic district. It's not a significant structure, but it is contributing, and I think it's still contributing. It's not an elaborate or unusual design, but it does contribute to the character of the historic district. It is located on the edge of the historic district, not in the midst or connected to other historic buildings. It's a building type that has become economically difficult to maintain, I'll say particularly in a downtown location in that configuration. It's a building type that is difficult to convert to other uses for the reasons that I stated. And so all of that makes it, unless you can find a very compatible use, all of that makes it difficult to imagine a rehabilitation in its current form. I also have talked about possible mitigations, but maybe I'll just stop there unless you'd like me to talk about them.
Mitigation in relationship to the condition?
If the building were to be demolished, I think it's important that there are mitigations that are put in place.
Are you referring, as I would understand it, John, to conditions?
I'm sorry, the what?
Conditions for the board to consider at that time?
Yeah, yes.
I think that'll be more appropriate to address at a later stage in these proceedings. When the board is considering the issue of demolition, I think it would be appropriate at that time in board discussion, prior to board discussion, for you to make, shall we say, certain recommendations for the consideration of the board as to possible conditions in this case.
Great.
In a similar way, the elements of the design of the new structure, which are not being presented this evening through conclusion, will return to you later in the hearing for your recommendations about design considerations and historic, shall we say, elements that you would recommend be considered in any new design of a replacement structure if we reach that point, as I expect, in a later part of the hearing.
Okay, makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Council.
Okay, questions from the board, from the commission? Mr. Hatch's comments about which really go through our ordinance very much piece by piece. Mr. Luber.
I do have a question. I'd like to poke a little bit on this relative amount of reconstruction or rehabilitation be required for the current use as a theater. In Mr. McManus's report, and I'm just going to read the 2 paragraphs in his conclusion, virtually all structural components that make up the structure in its current condition would require extensive rebuilding, reinforcing, or replacement. Many aspects of the current structure do not meet current building code requirements, such as design loads, seismic, wind, etc. The issues with the exterior bearing walls would have to be addressed by introducing remedial structure systems, such as a network of steel columns and beams to replace or supplement structural capacity of the current structure. That sounds like a lot to me. Do you agree with that assessment?
I am not a structural engineer, so and I rely on structural engineers in my work. I haven't worked with Mr. McManus before, but I assume that what he's stating is correct. He has said also that he ran calculations on the structural elements. That being said, there are different ways to address structural issues like that. And so, if I were looking at the building and working on a project and trying to figure out how to reuse it, and if it was reusable, all of that would cause me concern, and then I would try to figure out if there are ways that you could cost effectively address those issues. But they are certainly cause for concern.
Yeah, because I would assume a network of steel structures sounds like a lot to me. That sounds like you're ripping it apart and rebuilding it.
Yeah, yes, and if that were the case, I think it would not be feasible to reuse the building. Now, I've worked on buildings where the original steel structure was inadequate, and we were able to do, less drastic adjustments that were expensive but didn't involve wholesale reconstruction. So it depends. So anyway.
Yeah, because as I recall, the community theater, which was mentioned, that actually had a intact steel structure when they started the rehabilitation.
Yeah, I don't know the history of that structure.
Other questions from other board members? Solo?
And John, you made reference to the fact that if the building could be restored to its current use or current viability, there was some comments you made that there would be, or there were comments made from the public with regard to procuring of public funds from state agencies or whatever. In your opinion of the manner of this structure and its current condition, is that a realistic option for a structure of this type?
So there are two avenues for historic preservation funding. One is if the property is privately owned and it's income producing, you can, and if you do work that meets the Secretary of the Interior's standards, you can get a federal historic tax credit that's worth 20% of the rehabilitation costs. So that's one avenue. And it is theoretically possible. The problem, the issue here is that there have been so many alterations that it. I'm just trying to think if you could go down that route. There is evidence of what the original facade looked like, so you could theoretically consider restoring the original facade. The interior, there's not a whole lot of historic fabric. It would be an interesting discussion that you have to start with like, can you go down that path? Is there sort of enough historic fabric that you could go down that path? And that also impacts the second route, which is if this were publicly owned, either publicly owned or by a not-for-profit, it could apply for capital funding, for instance, from the New Jersey Historic Trust, which now, once again, is having relatively large capital grants, up to $750,000. Those are matching grants. Again, it would depend on the work that's being proposed. So, but that could be a potential route, but it would have to be in public or not-for-profit ownership.
Thank you.
This nuclear option that is before us in our historic district, the demolition possibility, is certainly of concern of the HPC, whose job it is to oversee and protect our historic district. In your experience as the 30 years of long night meetings, I think you said, at the Trenton Historic Preservation Commission and other agencies that you've worked on, does having a historic building in a district demolished lead to further demolition in a district? Does it bind the commission to approve all other demolition requests that come our way? Does it, what in your experience has this shown in the districts in New Jersey where you've been active?
It is a rare thing, but each application is viewed individually and on its own merit. And when demolitions have occurred, I have not, this is purely anecdotal, but I have not seen that there is sort of been a large-scale move toward demolition. And but I'm going to make one unsolicited comment just about the ordinance. I think in terms of demolition, the way your ordinance is written is not great. So it
duly noted.
So you have all the right criteria. It's just sort of the end result it's just not written super well.
But it's the ordinance we're working on
the
for
ordinance.
This application.
It is the law, so yes.
Other questions for Mr. Hatch?
I was pleased to see that you began to look at the wider context of the district by recognizing the surrounding linkages to the site. Would you agree with the National Register's 2004 definition of an historic district as a definable area possessing a concentration, linkage, or continuity of sites, buildings, and structures? And an historic district encompasses and blends together a mesh of structures, streets, and open space.
Yes, absolutely.
Since we are discussing possible demolition, the first criteria under 112-8 demolition that you spoke to refers us directly back to the 112-4B. And in that list of criteria, I think you may have spoken to the first one, the character, interest, or value to the borough. But I wanted to check in with you on item 4 on that list of criteria. Does the 1925 Lions Theater provide or embody a distinctive characteristics of a type, period, or method of construction, architecture, or engineering?
So I'm going to answer that two ways. So in general, in New Jersey or in the region, probably not. It's probably a relatively typical building, and structurally it's probably pretty typical, and its overall design is pretty typical. Now, that being said, for Madison, it's one of the, I don't know how many movie theaters there were originally, but it's it's the movie theater building in Madison. So that makes it important and makes this a really important discussion.
That's true. I mean, it does embody, I think, a distinctive type because it has.
One of the things that you look at in terms of, is it's, and maybe I'm adding something to what you said, in terms of rarity, I don't think it's a rare kind of design, and it's not as I said, it's pretty utilitarian, but it's distinctive as a 1925 downtown movie theater. It's distinctive.
And I think you pretty well spoke to the issue of its unique location as another criteria, the sort of
its
visual
location,
uniqueness of it.
It's an interesting location. As somebody who is not from Madison, on the one hand, it kind of feels a bit out of the way, like it's kind of a side street in a way. On the other, and maybe it's just the street is a little bit smaller than the other downtown commercial streets, and because it's right next to the track, it just feels a little bit different. On the other hand, it's right across from the main entrance to the train station, so that makes it that site very important.
I took some issue with your description of the location as obscure.
That's me as an outsider. I had trouble finding it the first time, so anyway, sorry.
And there's no direct train from Trenton.
I was driving. I didn't.
Yeah, you were driving.
Yeah, I mean, obscurity, I think in some ways, maybe you would agree, make urban contexts exciting, because you come around a corner and you find something unexpected.
Yes. It's a very nice street. It's a great street. So.
The urban planning of the town is unique. A lot of other towns don't quite have it. We don't have a town green, but we have this intricate web of streets in there. Unlike other towns, we have parallel streets to the main street. Those parallel streets allow for other types of flow to parallel the main street. Would you agree?
Sure, yep.
Did you read the 1989 application for the National Register of the Madison Civic Commercial District on the borough?
I did not read it exhaustively. I did go through it. So,
in that application, there were 4 buildings identified as semi-public. The rest were public or private. The 4 buildings that were identified as semi-public were St. Vincent's, Mead Chapel, the train station, and the library, which is now the museum. Would you agree that the post office and the movie theater could be added to the list of semi-public buildings?
Sure. What's listed as the public buildings? Because the post office seems like it could be actually public, but. And, I think a movie theater is a semi-public kind of a function, sure. And it's an important civic function.
Yeah, it's a little vague, I suppose, the characterization. For some reason, that was entered into the application and made me realize that buildings that are semi-public or public do provide, and I think you might agree, I think semi-public has to do with a time of day activity where the public engages with each other both in the building and in the spaces outside on the street.
It's tough to know where exactly to draw the line, but anyway.
It is. So to privatize that site is to take it from the domain of this somewhat vague description of a semi-public building and put it into the private domain. So it's no longer part of the sort of street fabric, perhaps. Would you agree, where we lose a little publicness by changing the...
As you're bringing up public and semi-public, I mean, retail in a sense is kind of semi-public, maybe not quite as public as a movie theater where you spend a lot of time, but anyway, it's an interesting point.
I think that's another reason why that location is particularly significant. So the termination of the view axis from the station's passage leads right into the vaulted marquee of the Lions Theater, as you've described. Another reason why it's a significant location. As a designer and a preservationist, what would you consider to be the most appropriate termination of the axis at the gateway into the downtown district? If you pick anything you wanted, what would be the best use for that site at that termination of the axis?
There are a number of gateway sites, for any town. So this one is a gateway site because it's right across from an entry to the railroad station. I think there are a number of functions that would be appropriate. A movie theater is an interesting one because if you can attract people to come to Madison to the movie theater by train, I don't know how often that happened, but that's sort of an interesting connection. The other kind of functions that you would want are ones that specifically serve people who are at the train station. So a cafe or a restaurant or a coffee shop. Those kind of functions. In a bigger town, you might want to have a hotel there. So there are a number of functions that would be appropriate there. Architecturally and urbanistically, you want something that's going to address that access, that entry. So,
thank you. You also talk in your report about some mitigating factors if we were to consider demolition, one being the fact that it's on the edge of the district. Now you talked about the row and the middle of a row being taken out. In fact, I think couldn't we also see an excellent, well-designed infill building slip right into a row very neatly?
And sure, if they're, I've worked on them, where buildings have been demolished in a historic district at some point in the past, and I've designed infill buildings that fit seamlessly into a row. I guess my point is, if there is an existing row, taking a piece out of it is a really it's damaging. It's particularly damaging.
Well, I think you might use if you talk about a row, so like a set of books in a row. The end building might well be considered a bookend. So to characterize the end building as a mitigating factor for allowing it to be demolished, I'm not saying entirely, but one mitigating factor, it seems to me our entire district is an edge. There's rarely a condition in the district where you aren't on the edge already. So if edge is the criteria, then the James Library, now the museum, could be demolished based on that criteria, as could the YMCA.
I see your point.
You mentioned vacancy as another mitigating factor. I think
not vacancy per se, because I really do think there are many buildings that are vacant that should not be demolished because they are well prepared for a new use. So I think vacancy should be considered in terms of the potential for a new use.
And then the last mitigating factor you mentioned was the utilitarian design of the building. As we discussed earlier, the idea of this kind of organic entity of an historic district that has multiple elements and sites and stories to tell, it's really an ensemble of buildings, contributing, significant, and non-contributing. So I'm not sure that I find your argument.
You're absolutely right. Yep.
Yeah.
I guess my point is, if this were a significant building, I don't think there should be any consideration of it. So,
thank you.
Yep.
Any other questions from our commission? Karen? No? Anyone else here? Miriam? Okay.
Mr. Wilson, anything?
No, I don't.
Okay. Or Mr. Kornfeld, anything? He asked you a question.
One question. I mean, it's not a major point, but in terms of the edge condition of the building, in one sense, it's an edge because it's the boundary of the district, but it's also a mid-block building. Can you comment on kind of that distinction?
I don't know if I can. I don't know. Do you have a particular point in mind, or?
No.
Since neither of you are in Madison, might I interject and say that it's, as one comes east on Lincoln Place and get to the train station and the theater, farther east there are only single-rise, what I would call taxpayer modern buildings that were clearly built outside the period of significance for the downtown district. So the edge was apparently logically made where the old building stopped.
Right. I don't think I have anything intelligent to say about that. Sorry.
Sorry to interrupt.
If I could just ask Mr. Kornfeld one question, and that is, Mr. Hatch made a statement that he felt that it could be restored to its prior four-theater configuration at a lower end of the spectrum of cost. Do you have an opinion in terms of that verbiage?
I would say that's the one statement that I wouldn't agree with, just in the sense that I think there's a high baseline cost for restoring the building to an operating use, whether it's, I know in a lot of cases there's a building where you can do a rehabilitation at a low cost, or you could do kind of a full restoration at a higher cost. But in my opinion, this building, there's a very high baseline cost for restoring it to a usable building at all.
Thank you.
Okay.
All right, thank you. And I believe we're ready to open to the public. Once again, I put on my annoying timer for 3 minutes so that everyone who wishes to speak will get a chance. And it's a question, right?
I stole the sign-in sheet, sorry. It's back now.
Thank you.
Sorry. Larry Wickman, Walnut Street. Yes. You had used the term utilitarian for the design of the building, and specifically the battlements that are the top of the building there. The raised, I guess they're called battlements. Some people call them that, but you can see it from both sides of the step nature. Can you speak to that feature as far as historic use of architecture goes? Because that seems to be a unique feature of the building.
I don't know if it's unique. I mean, it's. I think it's an attractive feature. You're talking about for the theater part of the building itself, behind the lobby. You can kind of see this.
I'm talking about the actual roof of the building and the stepped design in the back quarter of it. The high roof, yes.
I mean, I think it's attractive. I don't think it's necessarily unique. So when I say utilitarian, I'm not saying that it's not an attractive building, but I think it's pretty simple. The stepping is actually is probably easier to do than to have the brick walls slope. You kind of step it up. Okay. So it was both utilitarian and kind of an attractive feature.
Okay. To me, it seems to be a feature you see in a lot of older buildings along country roads and stuff, especially theaters. A lot have this type of stepped feature. Yeah. But the one thing I do want to say is the spires in town and the cupolas and all, if you step back from town and go to Main Street, you get a full vista of the town and the historic district, especially the features of the roof. And the new building could very well block that out from a historic building.
We're not talking, sir, at this stage about the building.
So, all right.
Come later.
Okay. So Dodge Field is a mile away from here. It's a baseball field on the other side of town, and from the pitcher mound there you can see the raised roof. So from a mile away, this is a feature that can be seen from the historic district.
That's a good point.
Excuse me?
A question about his testimony is what we're looking for right now.
Yes, I'm just saying from architectural, it's a unique aspect of the historic district that can be seen just like the cupolas in town from quite a distance away. Would you say the loss of this feature could impact the historic district?
I think the demolition of a contributing building in a historic district is, by its definition, an encroachment and has a negative impact on a historic district. So.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Other questions on the testimony?
Hi. My name is David Hanna. I live at 87 Central Avenue here in Madison. Hanna, Hanna. I had a question. Why do you think when they designed this building in the first place, they didn't have a third floor, even though the stepped part goes? Yeah. Were they thinking about the very thing we're discussing right now about sight lines coming out of the train station? Because the train station was built in 1916, correct? I think it 1916. I think it was 1916, so it predates, and thus, in other words, this discussion about sight lines and what you would see coming out of there. Do you think that had any bearing on their decision? I know it's conjecture, but
yeah, it's pure speculation. But I would say not. I would say that this was designed, to be what they considered to be the most financially viable downtown movie theater. Sorry, this seems to be going in and out. And so they designed it so that it had the uses that they thought made sense for the building. And I don't think, I think they lined it up quite purposefully and with the entry. But in terms of other aspects, I think it was a financial decision.
Thank you.
Please remember to sign in. Okay.
Okay. My name is Nancy Wallace. I live at 28 Maple Avenue. Wow, that's loud. Getting back to a point that Janet made, and I think you did answer it, but I didn't get the full thing. My main concern, one of my main concerns about demolition of a building in a historic district, what kind of precedent does that set? I think you did answer it. You said not necessarily. But I think I have to disagree with that. I mean, you take a building.
Question.
Ma'am.
Well, my question is, when you answered Janet, she had asked you about that. Are we going to be bound in the future to other buildings in the historic district? Is that what?
That's the question, yes.
No, but that is your question.
Yes, that echoes my question.
Did you answer that's not necessarily?
Right. So
let him answer.
Yeah. So the way I answer, so in my anecdotal experience, that is not the case. That demolition is always considered to be a drastic move in a historic district, and that one demolition doesn't set a precedence for another. That being said, I'll just clarify my point about the ordinance. So setting a precedence is not the issue here. I think your ordinance is the issue. So.
Okay, well, thank you. I just wanted to clarify that because that's a concern that I think a lot of people have, and thank you for clarifying that and ordering them.
Thank you.
Fix their ordinance.
Well, unfortunately, the HPC can't fix the ordinance. It's going to have to be the Borough Council.
We can fix it eventually, but not.
Just for clarity of the record, can I ask Mr. Hatchett, the reference that he's making is to the fact that a property owner, no matter what happens in the process, has the right to demolish the building?
Yes.
Thank you.
I think some people in the audience are interested in your answer, and it wasn't clearly broadcast. Would you just repeat?
My question? My question is the problem that Mr. Hatch was referring to with the ordinance, the fact that no matter what happens in the process, a property owner has the right to demolish the building.
And my answer was yes. I consider that to be the problem with the ordinance.
Yes. I think Mr. Laughlin explained that at the start of our meeting last time, that the Madison ordinance, all preservation ordinances are local, if I may speak. Ours allows discussion and potential conditions on a demolition, we can vote against it or for it, but ultimately an applicant has a property right to demolish what is on the property after consideration. So that is the law. That is what we're working within, and we're trying very hard to make it as informed a decision as possible. Are there other questions of Mr. Hatch from the public?
Hi, Sandy Kolakowski, Park Avenue, Madison. Mr. Hatch, you did talk about a number of viable movie theaters, and in your report, when you talked about them, you made some conjecture that these venues are smaller, all smaller than Lions Madison. And one of the theaters that you talked about was the County Theater, which has been in a survey that our group did quite a while ago. Would it surprise you to know that they're in the middle of, first of all, they had 2 screens and a seating capacity of 277.
Excuse me, to the extent that she's going to testify, this is the time for questions.
Will you swear before?
No.
You swear that the testimony you give will be the truth and nothing but the truth?
I do.
You're somewhat constrained, ma'am.
Okay.
No, just let me maybe this will be helpful. You're not permitted to testify.
Okay.
You're permitted to ask him, is he aware of certain situations that would pertain to his testimony, and follow-up questions that relate to what he has said, as opposed to what you would perhaps like to argue to the board at the commission at a later point. Thank you.
Speaking of this county theater, it surprised you to know that they're in the middle of a $4 million capital campaign to add a 180-seat screen theater?
Am I surprised? No, because I am aware of it.
So but then isn't it a little bit unclear to say that a smaller venue would be more successful? I guess I'm
going to say it 2 ways. So I think it's still smaller, even with the expansion. The county theater is a really special situation, and has been around for a long time and has been very successful at raising funds and at promoting itself. So I think it is a premier example of how a downtown has preserved a theater and is now, because of its long time efforts, and is now able to do fundraising to expand it. I don't know if they've raised the full amount of money yet, so I don't know when construction is starting. But I know that is in the works. It is a niche movie theater. It tends to show. I haven't been there in a while. I used to go there regularly. Independent films. So it's a very particular kind of a theater.
Right, but those kinds of theaters exist all across the country, I think. That are expanding at this time because of the success of local venues.
I can't speak to that. I know that there are some around the country, and it's perhaps true that some are expanding. So.
Well, I guess, would it surprise you to know that, in our conversations with the county theater, when we described our theater, they said the comment was, we would have given our eye teeth for that venue.
I didn't.
Couldn't
say.
Right, but they were pleased. I mean, that kind of setup is probably more economically viable than what they started with.
I just have
Any
to
other
object.
questions?
Okay, I'm
Any other
sorry.
questions?
I'm sorry.
1 minute. And
I have a minute left?
I gave you extra time, Sandy, so keep
Okay.
going.
Okay, just one more question. I mean, would you consider the corridor coming from the building that we're sitting in now, going through to the train station, and the going across to the movie theater to be a significant corridor of our historic district?
Yeah, I do think it's an important corridor, and it's an important axis, and it's, on the one end of the axis is the Hartley Dodge Memorial, and the other was the movie theater. So it's an important, I've said before, I think it's a very important site.
So anything that could be done to preserve it should be done.
You are putting words in my mouth, but I've said...
Should anything that could be done to preserve it then?
I think we're getting beyond the question phase again into the statements.
Thank you.
Are there other questions from the public regarding Mr. Hatch and his testimony to the board? And please sign in and then state your name so that our cheerful, hardworking stenographer can catch up.
I too want to be cheerful.
Thank you.
My name is John Morris. It's Morris, for the record. I live at 27 Bedford Court in Madison. I'm also the president of the Madison Area Chamber of Commerce. I have been for a number of years, but I'm speaking as a private citizen tonight. My questions are, in New Jersey, do you know of any new theaters that have broken ground in the last year?
New theaters, I don't, but I don't have exhaustive knowledge of the industry, but I don't.
But maybe in your travels, have you maybe seen an inkling of new ground being built? Or I don't know myself. I don't pay much attention to it. The reason why I ask is because obviously Netflix and delivery systems have completely changed. Buying habits have completely changed. So I just wondered if you had any firsthand knowledge.
No, I don't have any firsthand knowledge of any that have broken ground in the last year. I am working on the planning of a downtown location of potential small independent movie theater. But that's really in the planning stage. And as I said, they fit the model of the kind of niche theater that I've been talking about.
Thank you. Another question, please. Do you know of any other buildings that are theater buildings that are at similar state of disrepair as Madison's that are being brought back to life now, whether through nonprofit or private funding?
I don't, but not in my personal knowledge, no.
Right.
I didn't go to that symposium, though, so...
I just ask, just as a general, so the community is educated about the general state of affairs as far as theater goes, whether they're funded privately on a nonprofit basis, and what the appetite is actually for a new theater or a rehabilitated theater. That's my thinking. We all want what's best for Madison, and this is part of getting down to that.
Relate
Thank you.
Mr. Hatch's area of expertise are helpful. Asking what he had for dinner last night, but not what he's having tomorrow, I think. So, questions of Mr. Hatch's testimony from the public? Anyone else?
Can I ask in response to that?
If it's a question and relevant to his testimony.
Larry Whitman, Walnut Street. Riffing off of that specific line of questioning about how there's not a lot of theaters being built from the ground up anymore, the more they come down make ours that much more precious or rare.
Question.
Context, would you say that?
Question.
The more they come down makes ours more historical or rare. Is that a fair assessment?
It's a possible assessment, so...
Okay.
I mean, it partly depends, I guess, on the region, on what's present in the region, and competition and things like that. So.
On the original the registration form, this theater was the only thing listed for our arts and culture. Do you see anything in our current historic district that's arts or culture based like this?
I mean, you have a museum, yeah,
right. But I mean, something for mass audiences to.
Yeah, as like a performance space or something like that?
Yes, something art.
Not that I know of in the district, so.
Okay, so our historic district is void of that type of activity, I'm assuming. Maybe, okay.
Well, you're assuming, and he doesn't know, so it sounds like that's not really a question or an answer.
Okay. There's a theater in Phoenixville, Pennsylvania, which is an hour north, called the Colonial Theater. That theater not only restored itself.
We have a question.
Sorry, sir.
It's coming to the question, but it also.
It's like Jeopardy. You have to make it a question.
Yeah, but I got to give. I got to give this up.
An irrelevant question,
yes,
too.
Relevant.
To his testimony.
Okay. So they kept their theater, and they also just bought the deserted bank building next door. A theater can re-establish a historic zone and actually build upon it. So this is an old theater that is not niche.
We're going to get to comments.
We are so
later.
far astray from a factual basis and anything else.
We got it.
Okay.
Stick to Mr. Hatch's testimony.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Hatch.
Okay. Thanks.
Council. Yeah. Questions of Mr. Hatch, right?
Right, and I'm going to sign the sheet, which was not here when I was up.
Ooh, that's because of that miscreant.
Okay. Deborah Fennelly, Fennelly, 88 Constitution Way, Convent Station. Sorry, I can't talk and write. Mr. Hatch, I'm just going to ask you one question. Are you at all familiar with the town of Metuchen in Middlesex County?
You know, I am kind of in a general way. I have not been through the town in quite some time. So.
I was wondering if you're aware that very recently the town of Metuchen purchased the Forum Theater, which, as I drove by it yesterday, is very different looking from our theater, but I actually think it's much less attractive and actually not as old.
Question?
Please.
So I'm not
okay,
familiar.
I'm sorry.
To answer your question, I'm not familiar with it.
Okay, so may I ask you just a follow-up question? So it may be that there are other theaters in New Jersey that are being restored or purchased that you're not familiar with.
So speculative.
Yes, I can readily acknowledge that. So.
This is not a regular trial, it's a hearing.
I know, but we have.
Thank you, I'm done. Thank you, I'm done.
Hi, Melanie Tomaszewski, 46 Dean Street. My name is really long, so take your time with the stenographer. I don't do that. For 45 years, it's been a hard name to say. Tomas, Z is in zebra, E is in W, S-K-I, Edom. Awesome. Straight questions. Are you familiar with the Duress Theater in Boonton, New Jersey?
No.
Okay. Are you aware it's been for sale for 4 years?
No, I'm not aware of that.
It is the type of theater that has the screen in the middle. Do you know what that's called? Because I don't. It's the last one in New Jersey, New York.
Nope.
I'm going to make a statement now, sorry. Do you think $900,000 is fair?
Whoa.
Yeah.
You're asking about a theater he's not familiar with.
Oh, okay.
You're mentioning money which is not...
So do you think if there was a theater...
Let's not talk about...
No, I'm going to talk about the type of theater.
Let's not talk about buying or selling theaters elsewhere, okay?
Okay, sure. If there was a town that had this type of theater that George Burns performed in over 100 years ago, and it's the theater where you walk in and the screen is behind you.
Okay. Reverse.
Thank you. Pretty rare. And a town like Boonton would be hurting for, people to come in. Wouldn't somebody want to renovate that type of theater?
It's very speculative, but it sounds intriguing.
Sounds like a pretty cool deal for a town. And it's been sitting for 4 years.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm done.
Okay. Questions from the public? Are there any other questions for Mr. Hatch? Okay. If you're if you're coming, you can line up so we can be efficient about this.
Hi. Rich
Sign
Layton.
in and tell us your name.
Richard Layton, 45 Green Avenue.
You?
You said earlier that you find that niche theaters can bring people into a particular town. You think that's?
That's been my experience with some of these theaters. I mean, a good example of that is the Screening Room in Newburyport, Massachusetts. That's the one I'm most familiar with.
Right. I'm not familiar with any of the theaters that you mentioned, and I'm a very recent transplant here. I've been living here for 3 months, and I found that when I looked around at various towns to potentially relocate to, that I did look at the various niche theaters. That was an attraction to me, and I can't believe I'm alone in that.
So we need a question
Okay.
of Mr. Hatch's testimony, not
I answered your first
moving
question.
saga.
Okay. The town of Madison, the closest movie theater, is in Summit, which is a niche theater. There seems to be an audience for that type of thing here. Do you think, therefore, that a theater in Madison could support niche programming, revival house programming, that type of programming, rather than the multiplex kind of theaters that you can go see the same thing anywhere?
That's outside of
I think we're getting into a statement. You have to confine yourself, if you can, sir, to Mr. Hatch's testimony.
Okay.
Not to talk about other communities unless it's relevant to what he said.
I'm not a movie theater consultant, sorry.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, fine. All right. That was my only question. Thank you.
Bless you.
Okay.
Nancy Kingman, 38 Longview Avenue. You have to speak into the mic here. Okay. Nancy Kingman, 38 Longview Avenue. Can you spell your last name, please? Kingman, Kingman. Oh, thank you. My question is, you kept everybody.
Actually, if you just.
My question is, everybody keeps referring to the building as ordinary, not unique in any way. But my question is, if you look around, is there any question as far as rarity? In other words, this ordinary 1927 building was very typical of its time, but if you look around now in our surrounding times, our surrounding area, there aren't many of these movie theaters left. And I'm wondering, should there be some criteria that includes its uniqueness as something unique that exists now, that still exists, where it doesn't exist in other towns? You look at Summit, they used to have one. Morristown is now the Mayo. And Madison, one other question.
So let me just answer your first question. So you're talking about, so even if it wasn't, at the time it was built, a unique or fancy or unusual building, just, over time, downtown movie theaters have been demolished. And I think that's a valid concern. So it's a valid concern. So
I mean, if something is ordinary of another era, and Madison's sort of unique because it has a small time feeling and it hasn't changed that much, doesn't that make it unique, this theater, compared to other areas?
I mean, I think it adds to the importance of the building, and it's certainly one of the considerations.
I mean, if it was the only one left in the surrounding 500 miles, would that make it important?
Well, that certainly would, but I know that there are other ones within 500 miles. So
Okay, 100?
even 100.
No. But if things, I mean, the new movie theaters now, they're usually built like in strip malls or things like that, right?
Yes, that's correct. So
You're not going to have another building like this.
built like that. That's correct.
and it's representative of the town that it's in terms of us.
I've already.
Okay.
Yes, I think that's partly what I've addressed in my report.
And then one other question, we talk about how it has...
I'm sorry. Time. We've done time.
Oh, so just one thing. Could anybody look at the ceiling, please? I mean, it's covered with acoustic tiles.
Statements.
It's a question.
I didn't hear a question. Go ahead.
I said, could anybody look at the ceiling of this
We're asking
theater?
him.
Yes, I know, but
You're asking if he looked at the ceiling? That's
No,
the question.
could anybody look at the ceiling before they decide to demolish it?
I suppose sure, that's possible.
Because I think that could be a very unique feature. It might not be in good shape, but you'd have to look at it to find out.
Okay.
Thank you. Please.
Just for the record, there's numerous observations in all of the reports that are in the record regarding the ceiling and all the other elements of the building.
Okay, the gentleman behind you was actually up and coming
I'm sorry.
first.
I'm going to be very, very quick, and it is a pertinent question. My name is Carol Correa. I'm from East Hanover, 41 Mann Avenue. Correa, Corea. Yes, I will. Very quick question. And now I completely forgot what my question was. I'm sorry. Let me sign in. I'm sorry. I completely lost my train of thought. If I think of it, I'll say it.
Why don't you let the gentleman, the plaid, step in the way he was intending to? Thank you.
Dan Maharg, it's Meharg, and I live at 37 Greenwood Avenue. And I was hoping that you could speak a little bit more about the uniqueness of coming out of the train station. So if you've worked in New York City all day long, you're tired, and you get to the train station. I'm talking about the uniqueness of this situation. You come in through those arches and you see that marquee right there with the movie theater and what you can watch, the entertainment value of for commuters from Madison who use Madison as a station. It's a unique draw, is it not, that you get to see what entertainment is available after a long day of work?
I would think that that's part of the reason why it was put there to begin with. So when it was fully up and running and the marquee was going and all the lights were on and there were people going in and out, it probably was a nice thing to have at that location, sure.
And do you see that as a unique feature?
A unique feature. I think, there are many train stations, the development around trade stations were all often designed to try to take advantage of that travel. So I can't say that I've seen a movie theater in that exact position, but kind of urbanistically that makes sense. Do you want to take advantage of the travel?
So how many movie theaters in New Jersey still have that feature?
Which feature?
That you can see what movies are available as you get off the train, as you come in through the arches.
I have no idea. Probably not many.
So is that super important to consider then?
I would say it is. It's what makes that particular site important is that it's on access. It's one of the entrances to the train station. So. It is an important site in Madison, and that's why, yeah.
Yeah, I would just say the egress, the leaving of the train, isn't that you refer to it as the entrance, but isn't it the exiting off the train?
Sure.
And seeing the theater, that's super important.
Yep.
All right, thank you.
Sure. Did you remember your question?
Sorry, it's been a long day.
It has, and it's been a long meeting, so that's why I would urge, if anyone has any further questions, be articulate, don't repeat what other people are saying, and last call. All right,
Very quickly.
Korea.
Are your reports available to the public to see? Are they available somewhere online or somewhere that we
No,
can
they're
read
not.
them?
They don't get
Okay.
put online, but you can
Okay.
go to Fran Boardman's office, second floor of the Hartley Dodge, the building department, and she has all the materials from all our witnesses, from
Okay.
Thomas
Right, so we can
John
see
Hatch,
everything.
the original developer's plans, the supplemented developer's plans, and she's there from 8 to 5 every day.
Okay, great, thank you.
Okay. Have we?
We're talking about.
It would appear that we're talking about winding this up for tonight. Thank you all for your attention and patience. I think we need to continue and return to. Sorry, what?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I had one just procedural thing, and
Okay.
maybe this has already been addressed, but I believe we'll need another letter of voluntary extension from the applicant.
Yes.
Time-wise.
Mr. Laughlin raised that with me on a telephone call, and we'll grant that depending on what the extension date is.
Okay, thank you.
So if I can offer a couple of dates that our team is all available in terms of the people that would need to be here, the 22nd and 23rd of April.
Yes. April 22 or 3, yes. Is that it?
We have fallback dates, but if we...
Are these your preferences?
Yes.
Okay. How do I do this? We poll
With the board
ourselves right
No,
now?
you're also gonna
Find
have
out, do we have a
space
quorum on those
availability.
nights? I mean, we have a space,
We're
is
having
the
a
other
space
question.
availability issues. It may be that the best we can do is come up with a few options, because then we need to go through Fran to suss out whether we have a space in this building.
Okay.
Or whether we have to adjourn to another building.
Correct.
And that being the 2 days after Easter, that might be more of a challenge for that other space. Okay, so we'll talk to the town about those two ideal dates. Do you have one more less than ideal date that might work, just to throw it in the mix right now?
Yeah, the 6th or the 7th of May.
May 6th.
7th is a planning board hearing in this room.
Okay.
May 6th. Okay, let's try all those, and I'll send a note to our board, our commission, and see if we can land on a date. And meanwhile, we'll talk to the town, and we'll get back to you through Mr. Laughlin
Okay, and then
ASAP.
will you post? What's that?
We'd have to publish.
Right.
Right.
Thank you.
We'll come to a conclusion real quick.
Thank you.
So we stipulate this evening, Mr. Wilson, because the extension must be granted. We're
Well,
talking
grant an
about
extension
sensible extension beyond this evening to those proposed meeting dates.
Yes, sir.
It's a lot of shaking my head.
Yes, sir.
I'm going to communicate with the attorney who has registered an interest in these proceedings, Ms. Donato, as I mentioned to the board, and I've shared with you our correspondence, which I received earlier today. So I will respond to her as soon as we have the date agreed to. Is that acceptable? Thank you. Of course, Mr. Wilson, you'll get copies of all such communications.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Okay.
And thanks to the entire group here tonight for your continued patience.
Likewise.
And attention.
Thank you for everyone coming.
Are there comments or public?
Not this evening. The hearing we will follow, as we announced in the beginning, follows the format of public meetings under the municipal land use law. The application is presented by the applicant, and the witnesses testify, they're questioned. At the end of the presentation, there'll be an opportunity for statements or other items and evidence to be offered to the board. That's the established procedure, not to have comments during the course of the proceedings. And we announced that before, and that remains the procedure the board will follow. Thank you for your understanding.
Mr. Laughlin from NRDC.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
NRDC is here. I notified you earlier. Can they provide a witness? I emailed you earlier.
Are you talking about, I can't comment on who's going to testify. If you, it's not, I'm sorry?
During the day today, I notified you that NRDC would be putting comment in tonight.
Okay. Comments this evening? Comments this evening? No. And as far as a presentation of proofs, if you're saying, ma'am, you rise and come forward, please. Because, yes, please. I understand. Well, we have rules of procedure. Who is appearing and what they're going to do has to be explained to the board. Ms. Donato has registered an interest in coming forward to represent the Save Our Theater Group. You sent an email that says that representatives of
Natural Resources Defense Council
who intend to come into this hearing. Is that your advice to the board?
My understanding is that they wanted to provide testimony.
Okay, well, they can provide testimony based on what they're going to produce. They'd have to indicate what their interest is in the proceeding and what they intend to offer. Just as we shared reports and proceedings, you can't just say, I may show up or I may have something to say. There'll be an opportunity for that to be done. I would suggest that whoever is going to come in to either make a presentation through evidence and proofs or expertise, register that in writing with either the secretary of the board, drop it off at Ms. Boardman's, or communicate with me so we know who's going to come in and what they're going to say. That's how we're operating.
I thought I did that this morning.
No, you've indicated there are representatives who may be present. That's the order of march for the hearing. And this morning, in fairness to the applicant, everyone has to understand the order of, shall we say, proceedings, what's going to happen, who's going to participate, and what the interest is. To simply say representatives of an organization may come in and make statements is not sufficient to present a case. If you wish to present a case in evidence, you're permitted to do so, but you should go on notice with the commission and say who's going to come in and what they intend to say. Okay?
Right, I understand that, but if you recall the transfer of the emails, Ray Cody wrote to you and said that that would happen, and then I wrote to you and told you that was going to happen, and you said you received it.
I received it today, is that correct?
Yes.
Today. So I'm saying to you, please, the way we're going to proceed is, again, I request that whoever it is that you believe is going to come forward and offer comments or evidence, that if that's going to represent you...
Not representing us.
Okay, well, I don't know who they represent or what their interest is in the proceeding, but they should register with the commission if they intend to present evidence and proofs. If they want to make comments, they can make comments at the end of the proceeding.
The comment period.
Okay? Thank you.
Madam Chairwoman, we're going to be interested.
And I think that's been pretty clear, folks, from the beginning. It's not that anything is different from when we started. That's the way all land use hearings proceed. And people have the right to present their viewpoint, statements, and arguments or evidence, but it has to come at the right time. Thank you.
We appreciate that. We're going to want to understand the group. I went on the website. I didn't understand the connection to historic preservation, but there are questions of standing and relevance too. So if those representatives can comply with the suggestion, that will help.
Well, absolutely, and with time, so we can all read it and digest it and understand what is happening.
I think the commission is committed to conducting fair hearings on notice and for all viewpoints to be properly heard and considered. But we have to follow certain procedures as to how the hearings will proceed so that everyone has an opportunity to fairly participate and that all points of view that people want to come forward, they have the opportunity to do so, but it's at the right time. So that's why anyone who has any formal position should register that in writing other than the appearance to offer comments or an opinion to the board at the later stage of these hearings. We appreciate everyone's cooperation. It's a little unusual proceeding for the commission to conduct these type of hearings, so thanks again.
And may I say, am I correct in saying you can... Yeah, so we've concluded, we've heard our structural engineers from both sides, we've heard our preservation advisors from both sides. We heard an initial application from the developer. I think it's time to come back to Mr. Gertler and the refinements of his design when we meet again on one of those happy days, maybe April 22nd, and go through the revisions. And at that point, after he presents these revised designs, there will be time again for public questions of Mr. Gertler on his testimony from the meeting we haven't even heard yet. Please don't rewind 2 months and make us all try to remember what happened, because that was then and this is now. We're going to move forward with that design. and there will be questions for Mr. Gertler. Then I believe we will have the applicant's summation of their position on this, closing remarks, and then we open it to public comment. And then then I don't have to tell you it's a question, then it can be a comment, but depending on how many hundreds of people want to comment, I'm going to be really strict about 3 minutes, because even if 100 people show up and want to comment, that is hours and hours and hours. So we're going to have to encourage people to be clear, brief, and to the point, so that we just don't want to, be upset because we're sitting here till all hours. Clear enough? Does that suit
I just
you?
have one other point.
Yes.
I just talking to the client, just have a concern that because we don't know the availability of the room and the availability, that we really are leaving without a specific date. So our suggestion would be, if one of these interim dates can't work, then we would do it on your regular May 14th date.
Would be the May 14th. That's a fallback, but you'd like to go sooner.
We would, but I think...
Understood.
I think if we let the public know that if we can't get a regular date, which will be noticed in accordance with the law,
right,
that would be a fallback, because theoretically everybody will be available on that date.
It's May 14th.
Right. The second Tuesday is our regularly scheduled meeting, but we'll see if we can do something in between. Yes, sir.
Did everyone hear that? The applicant is indicating if there is not a further hearing date arranged, according to the April dates of the first week in May, which would require further public notice, that unless that happens, this application would be continued at the regular May meeting of the commission, which is May 14th?
Yes.
May 14th at 7:30 p.m. So watch the website and keep in touch with the commission office as to following the next date, but that's the official continuation date this evening, unless it's re-noticed for a different time. But again, please monitor the borough's website. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
I believe we are adjourned then. Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry you didn't go break.
We're tough.
27 minutes. Okay.
I'm aware.